Hello. Welcome to the continuation of our reading of the book The Sacred and the Profane by Mircea Eliade. I remind you that the book has only 4 chapters. We are already conducting the lecture related to the second chapter. It's clear that it would be much better, much more beneficial, if you were following along with the reading. We'll be wrapping up this series soon. Don't miss the opportunity to follow along by reading. You will make some very interesting discoveries. I have some credibility with you because, up until now, I've never recommended a book that wasn't worth it. So, I hope I make the most of this opportunity. Shall we? So, for those who remember the lecture we did on the first chapter, we talked about sacred space. Here, Mircea Eliade focuses on the idea of time. Of sacred time, in other words, one who is redeemed from arbitrariness. He says that the religious person is the one who knows how to make this transition from the profane to the sacred, both in space and in time. Therefore, he makes a very interesting etymological citation, which I wasn't aware of, based on an author you can check in the book itself, stating that the word time and the word temple might have a common etymology from some distant root. In other words, the Latin tempus and the Latin templum would come from some point of a similar reality. Such is some way to measure the space where we live. In other words, that space which is defined by Egyptian tradition between the sky and the earth, which man uses as a stage to develop the drama or whatever you might classify as human life. Therefore, he talks about the upper opening that a temple has. We talked a lot about this last week. That very opening, or sometimes like a needle, something that symbolizes this connection with the celestial. Therefore, such an opening that is made in sacred space must also be made to create sacred time. Moreover, we will talk about ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and rites, which play a vital role in separating ordinary time from sacred time. But the idea, see how beautiful and interesting this is. It's that this sacred space extends and all places become sacred. That this sacred time extends and all of life becomes sacred. This is the goal of the religious person. There, he has a reference, a beacon, but from there, it should be extended as far as possible. And this is a life goal. He will then tell us that there exists a primordial mythical time, a cosmogony, where all things were created. And the religious person is contemporary with this cosmogony because he brings it into the present, he revives it annually. There is a founding myth, a creator myth of humanity, and periodically this myth is revived through celebrations. So, he is contemporary with the gods who created everything. He knows how it was created, therefore he has a recipe for creation. He knows all the things that are born, what ingredients they contain. In other words, he lives the myth, he renews the myth annually. This would be, for example, one of the reasons for the celebration of the New Year in so many civilizations. Sometimes people ask, a year for one civilization starts on a certain date, for another on a different date. What sense does it make to celebrate the New Year if it only applies to a specific group? Culture, geographical context, history, it all matters. The physical time, the chronological time, the clock time doesn't really matter. What matters is the psychological time, which means you've closed a cycle and now you're going to start anew. And this energy of new beginnings is what gives us the opportunity to renew hopes, renew strengths, purify ourselves, shed the shells of the past, and embark on a new opportunity. Leave the shadows of the past behind, so they don't become a ball and chain tied to our ankles. Moreover, as I have already told you so many times, the tradition of the Bardo Thodol says that sometimes we carry such a heavy iron ball on our ankle that it does not allow us to take a step towards human growth. This is the moment to die, because we don't know how to free ourselves from the past. Notice that the whole process, sacred from the sacred time, relied on this, on giving man an opportunity to free himself from this iron ball of the past. Very interesting, very beautiful, and it comes from a deep understanding of the human psyche, which perhaps we no longer possess in our days. We know very little about man, however, we know a lot about the things man creates. But there is a disconnect between human growth and the growth of the things he creates. In other words, external technology versus internal knowledge are in two different historical times. One in the 21st century, the other who knows when in the past. A disconnect between the rhythm of internal and external growth. Continuing, then, he will talk about sacred festivities, which operate with a reversible and recoverable time. In other words, the moment of creation must be revitalized, it must be relived. It's very common, as you will see in traditions like those in India, that all sacraments, all celebrations, must be relived, must be revitalized. Consciousness moves forward, it overcomes adversities, it finds itself in a different circumstantial context. It has to reaffirm its vows. So a marriage vow, a vow of any commitment, is renewed at the end of each cycle. It is revitalized. Therefore, if you consider a cosmogony where the gods created humans, that is also a commitment, that is also a sacrament, which must be revitalized, because humanity has not yet fully come to life. This birth has not yet finished happening. Therefore, this pact, this commitment, this initial teaching, and this proposal for the future of humanity must be brought back and remembered. This reconnection, sacred time provides. He talks a bit about something quite interesting. You will see that he mentions several Native American tribes, indigenous peoples. He says there is a connection between the year and the world. The word year and the word world. As if a year were a complete world, a sphere of experience that is whole and enclosed. In other words, closing a year would be like closing a world, where experiences were lived, learned or not, assimilated or not, but there it is a closed, complete world that must be properly concluded so that another door can open. Quite interesting, this connection between space and time. In other words, a universe has closed, circumscribed within this circle. He taught me things, and I have to go out into the world with these things, but I must leave behind the price I paid to learn them. I cannot carry shells, I cannot carry them. A ball and chain around my ankle. So he even mentions that some of these villages had huts, tabas, which were dedicated to the sacred. And in these huts, there were 4 openings, which marked not only the cardinal points of space, but also the 4 seasons of time. The connection with the coordinates of space and time, so that humanity knows how to live it, how to record it, and how to transcend it. Notice that today we live in a certain alienation, thinking that we have nothing to learn from the past. And perhaps a civilization that we consider as aboriginal, as very primitive, understands better this relationship of humanity, of what the Kybalion spoke about. Intelligence, one of the characteristics of intelligence, is moving from the known to be unknown, through a symbolic vision, through similarity, through humanity's love for mystery. And this journey, which is so complicated for modern humanity, perhaps other civilizations of the past, quite primitive from a technological standpoint, knew how to navigate much better. In other words, to reach the much dreamed of evolution of human society, we must gather pieces from all moments of history, from space and time. He will continue talking about another very interesting thing. Mythical time inaugurates time. There was nothing before or after. Consider, for example, my time, Lucia's time. It was born with Lucia and will die with her. My time was born the moment I introduced myself to the world. The time of things is a limited stage, with an experience X to be lived, what the Indians called Dharma. The time of humanity was born, and it was organized based on this creation myth. Humanity must have coordinates and know where it started from. What expectations existed on the part of these creator beings when they created it, and where it is meant to go. a reference of direction in time and space, which allows one to move with confidence. In other words, it's impossible to know if your current step is right or wrong if you don't know where you want to go, where you'll end up, or the reason that brought you into the world. How can we establish priorities without knowing the reasons we came into the world? And where do we want to go with all of this? So everything was very well defined. Time was born with the myth. The myth founded time. In the same way we saw in the last class that myth found space, awakens space, gives it meaning, guides it, and ensures that all of this is endowed with value, redeemed from chaos, from arbitrariness. Continuing, he talks about the altar of fire, which was celebrated in India and still is, the altars raised to Agni. Many times these altars are at the top of a staircase with 360 steps. In other words, you advance towards the fire, which represents spirituality, which represents wisdom, traversing through time. And time is real when you've climbed a step towards the fire. If you haven't moved, there hasn't been real time. Simply put, an artificial, illusory, profane time has passed. Real time is measured by movements towards the ideal. Notice how all of this is filled with teachings that would be very valuable for us, people who can calculate the speed of a comet approaching Earth. But they don't know what real time is in their lives. It's something a bit curious and even bizarre. The world renews itself annually, and this renewal must be deeply experienced by humanity. A new time comes, a pure time, a time dedicated to a new experience, where you only keep from the past what allowed you to grow. And you embark on a new experience, without scars, without traumas, without carrying the weight of the cost that past experiences have given you. This is an interesting element. Once again, the Bardo Thodol says that if we knew how to carry only the fruit of past experiences, and not the weight, how much they cost, perhaps death would not be necessary. Isn't that brilliant? Death comes to free us from this weight that we didn't know how to leave behind. Because we no longer knew how to live the right. We didn't know how to usher in the new, pure year. We didn't know how to practice renewal within time. And they are tools, the processes of life, the protocols, the canons of Apollo, as the Greeks would say. Knowing how to deal with space and time. The two coordinates of life. We can say, for example, that human sadness, according to Mircea Eliade, it's very beautiful when he says that human sadness comes from an absence of reality, an absence of meaning, an absence of direction. In other words, metaphysical reality redeems humanity from chaos, from disorientation, and grants them the fulfillment and happiness that corresponds to them as such. The happiness of someone who has ascended a step towards the altar of Agni. In other words, much of human anguish, for which we often seek so many remedies and nothing heals, we seek remedies for a voice that is telling you, climb the ladder. And there is no other solution, no other way to heal it. In other words, metaphysical reality, metaphysical values, the sanctification of life, redeems human life from chaos and imbues it with meaning. Notice that this is something for us to reflect on for a long time, because I often see the topics that are discussed in our current world. I wonder how many questions a book like this would have answers for. For how many serious problems people ponder over. How many questions would a work like this offer truly plausible answers to? And then he will talk to us a little about the religious man. This homo religiosus he refers to as the true threshold between pre-human experience and properly human experience. He says that for the non-religious person, the quality of timelessness, the quality of sacred time is inaccessible. He cannot conceive of anything beyond one day after another, a mechanical passage of time that, with fulfilling an eternal return always the same. Because when time becomes sacred, each time it returns, it no longer returns at the same level. Therefore, it is like imagining a person walking in circles. It is monotonous. It is tedious. Soon they will become apathetic. Maybe soon they will be unmotivated and eventually depressed. Why? Because the experience repeats itself eternally without bringing any freshness. Now, if each time the experience repeats, you're at a different level, you're no longer walking in circles. Instead, you have a spiral that might take you to a very elevated point. In other words, you are seeing the same reality, but always from a higher angle, with rarer air, with a perspective view. In other words, life does not repeat itself. It is like walking. We walk taking very similar steps, but we are always in different places, so walking is not monotonous. Now, if I just keep marching in the same spot, it would soon become monotonous. In other words, the transition from profane time to sacred time is inaccessible to the non-religious man. Religious for the man who lacks the symbolic vision of life. And this makes life become tremendously repetitive and tedious. The religious man is a contemporary of the gods, he preserves their work, he is a learner. In other words, I didn't quite understand it or I forgot, because we constantly forget. As the wizard Merlin used to say, the greatest evil of man is forgetfulness. I return to the tutorial of humanity. In other words, I relive the cosmogony. I relive the way things were created, and not just the way, the know-how, but also the why. The where-to. These are two coordinates that we often do not know. Why was humanity created? And to reach where? What is its function on Earth? What is its role on Earth? In other words, I am a contemporary of the creators and I witness their creation, and I share in their intention, and then I return to common time, with the intention of also creating with that same spirit. Also, I am able to generate a real time, because profane time does not exist for the religious person. He will talk a bit more about this later, and look, it's beautiful. If you take a moment to reflect, you must have had several experiences in your life that endorse this. At a certain point, we look and say, it cannot just be this. What is the meaning of all this? What is the why? What is the destination? We feel that life is. There's a lack of an instruction manual, a lack of guidance, a lack of direction. And it says that the religious person is thirsty for reality. Thirsty for reality. Profane time is not real. It is a play of shadows. In other words, it is like you have been invited to a game where no one taught you the rules. Moreover, you keep randomly playing cards on a table. You don't know who's winning. You don't know who's losing. You don't know who wins, what they win, who loses, what they lose. And simply, each time it is your turn in the round, you throw down cards with symbols you don't understand onto the table of time. This is unreal. It's so unreal that it ceases to exist, a characteristic of things that are not real. They are fleeting, they are ephemeral, they turn to dust, because in truth they have always been dust. So the religious person, they will say, is thirsty for reality. Then he delves into something I found very interesting and necessary at this moment, which is the definition of the religious person. Moreover, I also delved a bit into etymology to enrich this reflection of his, and I found it very interesting. If you notice that the prefix comes from intensity, from repetition, in the middle of the word religious, from the word religion, you have ligere, which means to connect, to bind, to unite, and finally the suffix yam or yam, which means act or effect. In other words, religion would be the act or effect of reconnecting. To reconnect something that was once connected and at this moment has become disconnected. It's interesting if you notice, because if you go back to the Proto-Indo-European root, take the root ligu, you'll see that the religious act was more connected to performing the rite, rather than organizing a doctrinal corpus of a particular religion. That's why there would be a difference. An etymologist whom I respect greatly makes this observation, and I found it excellent. The difference between the believer and the religious person. The believer is someone who believes in a specific religious corpus. And the religious person, in fact, is the one who knows how to reconnect, to bind again, that is, to establish a bond that makes the laws of heaven, as Confucius would say, reflect on earth, that makes the sacred return to order and give meaning to the profane world. In other words, a religious act is a rite, and we will explain shortly what that is. A religious person is someone who knows how to perform the rite to live life Socratically in all its moments. Because what is not New Acropolis, USA is a sign that it shouldn't be happening. Everything that is worthy of being done by a person should be New Acropolis, USA. And the one who knows how to make this bond, that is the religious person referred to by Mircea Eliade. Are you noticing how many powerful and interesting things are here? He talks a bit about the nostalgia for origins. Every religious person has a nostalgia for the beings who came here. How many mythologies speak of a primordial time when beings came here, one or several beings, to teach humans how to be human? They even taught their basic activities, like agriculture, forming a family, and raising children. They taught humans the principles of human life. He says that every homo religiosus, every religious person, has a nostalgia for this original moment. And from time to time, it must be ceremonially revived, so that one can return to the presence of what is real, so that your life may be illuminated with meaning. Once again, remembering, the sacred is precisely the function of giving meaning. I often recall a passage from Plato where he talks about beauty, saying that when a man, a true human being, contemplates the beautiful, he does not feel the desire for possession. A true man and true beauty. When he contemplates this, he feels nostalgia, a longing for a world where everything was harmony, because beauty is harmony. In a certain way, he sees through the beautiful a world where he has already been, to which he intends to return. In other words, Eliade is saying here that this is a characteristic of the religious person who longs for a world they are still building, which at this moment exists only in the realm of ideas. An interesting point he makes is that, from the perspective of current rationalist thought, it is considered that this homo religiosus, this primitive man and primitive, already carries a certain pejorative connotation, was paralyzed because he didn't change, he didn't advance his life. He was constantly repeating a myth of the beginnings, of the origins, and repeating, and repeating, and repeating, and this didn't allow him to move forward. Eliade will say, "Look, this is probably the person who advances the most." Because the human being is far from being a complete human. We are full of latent powers, of unrealized possibilities. And every time you illuminate the world with this light of original ideas, of our original model, of the original intentions of those who created us, you illuminate new possibilities for humanity, which has the opportunity to come to light. This causes humans to shed light on themselves, becoming more and more complete. Whereas the modern man, the profane or ordinary man, he says, does not advance much from a human perspective. He advances a lot when it comes to personal interests. The primitive man, the religious person, is the one who commits to the cosmos and constantly returns to this creation to remember their role in the world. Moreover, he says that the profane man only commits to his personal interests, that is, at most to a very narrow circle around him. He works only for the individual. He doesn't have a vision of the cosmos, doesn't have a vision of the one, and doesn't commit to much more than his own skin. In other words, who grows, who is paralyzed. From the perspective of human growth, the profane man does not climb a single step on the ladder towards the altar of Agni, to the fire, to wisdom, to completeness. In other words, real time is much more present in those who are concerned with introducing milestones that illuminate their life, reminding them of who they are. And these were the rites. I found this phrase wonderful, and I've repeated it to myself many times to see if I can memorize it. A person is truly human only when they imitate the gods. By leaning forward, he reaches himself. Stop, think about how beautiful this is. So, imagine a stone. A stone is there, experiencing resistance, inertia. Notwithstanding, you notice that when it becomes a bit more complex, a bit more elaborate, it starts to vibrate due to heat. For example, expanding or contracting, which is a characteristic reminiscent of, for instance, a plant. A plant is sensitive to heat and cold. In other words, it seems that even stones, when they start to have slightly more molecular structure, slightly more complex, and begin to lean towards the future. Plants, on the other hand, are so sensitive to energies, serving as the foundation of the food chain, and they engage in gas exchanges with the environment. In other words, they produce the food for all organic life. They work with energy. Some of them, we notice, are already a bit sensitive when the owner shows a certain affection. When the owner notices them, those people we say have a green thumb. In other words, the perception and feeling of emotions is something that belongs to the future in animals. And the highly evolved plants lean towards the future to become themselves. If you consider animals, what is the function of an animal? A good survival, a good perpetuation of the species, 2 instincts. But those that are a bit more complex, a bit more evolved, you look at them and say, wow, it seems like they think. Because they are so clever that sometimes they even manage to fool the very humans they live with. In other words, to be themselves, they lean towards the future. What about us? Call it God, the God of the world of ideas. I'm not here preaching any kind of theology, but you notice that when a person leans towards the metaphysical, which would be a future for them, they live a mental reality. And the metaphysical for them is the future. By leaning into this, they find themselves. In other words, in this search, in moving forward, he finds himself. And this was one of the foundations of traditional human thought, of the man called ancient or archaic. It's very difficult to measure whether humanity is advancing or retreating if, as human beings, we don't know where we want to go. Without a reference for direction, we cannot say we are evolving. Evolving in what? In relation to what? To whom? The things we do, perhaps. But it's very doubtful, as I mentioned in various lectures, whether it's worthwhile for a person without a solid moral foundation, without maturity, to have such powerful means without knowing what the ends are. Perhaps we might reach disastrous ends even faster. With cruder means, it might have been slower. Acts that do not imitate celestial models for the religious man, for the traditional man, are completely devoid of meaning. So, for this traditional man, there wasn't much interest in descriptive history, the conscious history as we have today. Because an act performed by a person which did not make themselves or anyone around them a bit more human was devoured by time. It is not worthy of being remembered. Of course, this reminded me of the American Amalthas among the Incas, who were historians. The Incas were an illiterate people. They did not know, at least as far as we know, they did not know writing. How did they record the history of their Sapa Incas, their great leaders? These Amalthas composed songs, but they only created songs about the lives of men who were worthy of being remembered, whose stories were uplifting for the future, who had overcome some barrier, who had come closer to the gods, closer to themselves. In other words, one of the things a mediocre man could consider as certain is that he would be banished from history, and in some way banished from eternity. Then comes this duality that is often still discussed today between history and myth. For the religious man, what matters is the myth. Like the one who preserves the spirit of events, and not necessarily their physical form. The mutus, the mute one who is behind the body of facts, and who tells the why, the where and how much has been achieved. There is then a relationship with life where values are very distinct, and a very clear and reiterated focus on, with all the choices one makes. Continuing, let's talk a bit more about the myth and the right, which we've discussed so much up to now. Reiterating what we mentioned earlier, he will say that myth reveals how things came into existence. In other words, it establishes the universe of each thing, the world. The myth tells how things were born, why they were born, and where they should arrive. The recovery of this symbolism ensures that beings never lose their way, never get lost along the way. Therefore, it's a heritage. It is extremely important for these civilizations to preserve the myth of their founders, the myth of the founder of the universe, the cosmogony. It is essential to not forget who you are, to not lose your identity. He will say that the right revives and recovers meaning from the seemingly mundane. I mentioned to you earlier that the right is what ensures time is oriented. It revitalizes the myth. If we take a symbolic structure, we will see that the myth, it is a timeless reality. The myth deals with how human beings emerged from ignorance and reached wisdom. Represented in a symbolic way, evidently. Symbols are a representation in a given civilization of what that myth conveys. So, if we were to be precise, we wouldn't say, for example, the myth of King Arthur, but the symbolism, the symbolic cycle of King Arthur. Prianavas is about what? The myth of the hero embodied among the Celts. Hercules, the myth of the hero embodied among the Greeks. So you have a timeless myth, you have the symbol, which is situated in time and space, and you have the right. What is the right? When at a certain moment I face a difficulty and respond to it as Arthur would, or as Achilles would, or as Arjuna would. In other words, at that moment, who was Arthur, who was Achilles, who was Arjuna? They came into the world, took on flesh and bone through my experience. And when I live the myth, when I behave exactly as expected of a human being, this is a time that steps out of chronological time. It is called in Latin in illo tempore. Eliade constantly refers to such an expression. Out of time. The great art of man is to steal moments from time for eternity. Then you captured a piece of eternity in the midst of time. You were Arthur. You were Achilles. You were Arjuna. That's why sometimes some historical claims about whether Arthur existed or not seem a bit strange to me. How did he not exist? He exists all the time. Every time a person lives the myth, Arthur comes back to life. It's a framework for giving meaning, for illuminating things with significance. As Roger Scruton would say, redeem facts from banality. Redeem facts from time for eternity. Therefore, man embeds real facts in the midst of illusory time. He embeds eternal facts in the midst of fleeting time. Fragments of eternity. And that is the only thing of value in this entire interval we spend on the stage of life. How much reality have we been able to embed within the illusion? The right revives and recovers meaning from the seemingly mundane, as we've already discussed. It creates a bridge. And this applies to countless events in our lives. Remember when I said that all of life should be sacred, all space and all time? And these sacred festivals were so that man would not forget who he was, and bring that back to his time. Moreover, extend these trenches of light against the shadows. Therefore, if you notice, bringing this to a very practical experience that many of us live when you dedicate your energy and your children, and they grow up and they leave. Today, this is a problem. It's called the empty nest syndrome. People suffer. It seems paradoxical. At a certain point, a being was placed in your life, and you felt called to give yourself completely. And suddenly, he is no longer there. As a fact, embedded in an illusory time, there's no way to redeem this pain. But imagine if you read a myth where throughout history there were several men who allied themselves with the gods, allied themselves with life, with the purpose of helping the consciousness of travelers to advance one more step. In other words, an Indian Narada, for example, who was a man who would align himself with the laws of nature, align himself with Dharma, to help beings, to push them a millimeter in the direction of God, a millimeter further up the ascent towards the altar of Agni. And these beings did not lose those who ascended, quite the opposite. A face that draws near to the fire is closer to the fire of its own heart. Imagine understanding the story of Narada and many other beings from Indian tradition and others who stood between men and gods as helpers to push the wandering consciousness of beings here more towards the light. Did you do this for your children? Did you do this for your friends? Did you do this for the people who interacted with you? We never lost them. They are getting closer and closer to the fire. And you are also fire. You realize that understanding this is a mythical covering that redeems the pain. No, wait a minute, so I haven't lost anything. So, this fact is imbued with meaning. Life is not unfair, it doesn't give with one hand and take away with the other. This is part of it, this is a myth, I fulfilled the myth. And that was a right within my life, that was sacred. Therefore, it is said that the man who knows how to live the myths redeems all the events of his life from arbitrariness, because it consists of a sacred mold, which makes all events endowed with meaning, allowing their sense to be recovered, and abandoning this appearance of arbitrariness that hurts us so much and causes us so much suffering. He will talk, for example, about a representation that existed in Babylon every year. At the beginning of the universe, Marduk would have killed the monster, the demon, Tiamat, who was like a serpent. He would have killed and shattered Tiamat's body. This evil monster, and with these pieces, he would have constructed all the parts of the manifested universe. And this was dramatized every year, at the start of each new cycle. Again, a group of people would embody roles as actors, the role of Marduk. Others would embody the role of Tiamat, and this symbolic battle was performed, with Tiamat being defeated once more. The ordered time, the pure time, the cosmos was re-established once again. Chaos had been defeated. Well, and what can this illuminate in our lives? You realize that our constant struggle is to subordinate everything that is an evil, but that cannot dominate our lives, which is the instinctive part, the animal part, the part tied to mere survival. Survival cannot subjugate life, because otherwise we are not humans. We stop being centaurs and become minotaurs, the less human animal. We must constantly reaffirm our power over these animalizing forces, imposing human consciousness over animal consciousness. And with the energy. From this animal interface, with the life energy we draw from these instincts, we go on building our human world. We go on paving and building the valuable aspects of our human world, sublimating these energies that come from our animal nature. In other words, every year, we don't just do this externally, we do it internally as well. We reconstruct the cosmos from the submission of chaos. And then he will talk about the meaning of so many festivals in various traditions, which were called festivals, that we know as carnivalesque, where for a time chaos was allowed to reign, so that afterward a heroic being, a divine being, would come to subdue the chaos, subdue the disorder, and order would be recreated. Over time, the calendar changed, and this ended up on a different date. But initially, it was at the beginning of a new cycle. Chaos is reintroduced, and order is inaugurated once more, marking a renewed year where man comes pure, stripped bare, containing only the essence of past experiences, not their packaging. An interesting thing he mentions in the book is about literalism and how dangerous it can be. He mentions that in certain civilizations, it's not uncommon, we've heard about this, that at a certain point, when you say kill the monster, they embody a human or an animal as the monster, and they go and literally kill it. They hold blood festivals because the myth ceases to be symbolic. It stops having multiple interpretations. It is no longer seen symbolically and starts being viewed literally. So, many primitive civilizations, many, let's say, tribes and larger peoples celebrated blood sacrifices because they took the myth literally. And look, literalism, between us, it's terrible to know that there was cannibalism, that there were human sacrifices, it's horrifying. But let's see, we are not free from literalism. When we start interpreting things literally, especially from an ideological or religious standpoint, literalism, and also produces victims in our historical moment. We also cause deaths because of the literalism with which we literally believe in things. In other words, if we take literally how many cults claim to have the only truth, the only path, how many claim to have the only certainty, and often this leads to an aggression that can even escalate to physical violence, and how much this still happens. In other words, literalism, the lack of ability to symbolize, to interpret myths, didn't just make victims in past civilizations, it still makes victims today. But that does not mean that man or religious people, the ancient man, is stripped of their beliefs. It is the risk we still run. Well, speaking a bit about the festivals, he will say that the sacred calendar is not just about celebration. It's not even primarily about celebration, it's about renewal. It's about renewing, once again, the meaning. Remember, I always like to remind you of this, that moment when Camelot is about to be founded, when Arthur sends his knights to the four corners of the kingdom to fight the enemies who oppose the creation of Camelot. They return from the four corners of the world, meet Arthur on top of a mountain, and begin to celebrate. Merlin commands everyone to be silent and says, "Keep this moment in your memory. Tell your children and your grandchildren, I was with Arthur that night." Because the greatest evil of man is forgetfulness. We must remember that at some point we were there with Arthur, which has a meaning in organizing our world. Submit to chaos, establish a boundary where light prevails, govern from a mountain that represents the highest within us. We have to recall these parameters. And these seasonal, sacred celebrations were meant to be a renewal, more than just a celebration. I want to draw your attention to something that is very strong within me, and always has been, which is a love that I still feel, somewhat unexplained, for Christmas. Well, it is because I was a child and I liked guests, though there were not always guests. Sometimes it was a very simple celebration, but the fact that Christmas was approaching, and I still feel this today, something strange stirs within me when I see the Christmas decorations starting to appear. As if it were a grand gathering, something very magical is about to happen. I am heading towards a great gathering. Many times when I dive deep within myself, I realize what I am so eager to reconnect with. Christmas is birth, Christmassy birth. Something inside me is eager to be born. And this is the ideal meeting point for this element to take notice. Temporal, sacred, eternal. Be present in my life and remind me of who I am. Perhaps ultimately we can say that it is the meeting of the mundane self, the profane self with the sacred self. It's that you remember what your life is, what your true identity is. And even if we can't rationalize it, something inside us leaps with joy. It's coming again. The cradle is being assembled. It's an opportunity to be reborn. Even though today it is often reduced to being called merely commercial dates. We have lost the deeper meaning of life. The cardinal points and the seasons of the year are the 4 points that guide the world. And they are an invitation for us to step out of the mundane temporality to sacred life. Meeting points with something that is beyond. Openings upwards, as they used to say about time. There must always be an opening upwards. The rites, the sacred celebrations, are an opening upwards. Where we ventilate ourselves, we look in the right direction. Well, as I mentioned to you, the great objective is Imitatio Dei. The imitation of the sacred act that created the universe in all the creations of our life, in every moment of our life. The human act, every dignified human act, we could borrow a bit from Immanuel Kant, which is the categorical imperative. All those acts governed by duty, everything that is inherent to the human being, was born from a divine act. So, if you take these traditional myths, cosmogonic creators, of being taught how to cultivate corn, wheat, to cultivate the land, to form a family, even the sexual act was taught there. And everything that imitates this primordial model, which is endowed with meaning, which is constructed from the perspective of real time, inaugurates human acts. Human acts could not perpetuate themselves if they did not follow this divine model. What happens is that at a certain point, the decline from homo religiosus to homo profanus causes these acts to become empty and lose their meaning. They fall into trivialization, become profaned. An example he gives is agriculture. It's very difficult to find a classical civilization where agriculture, the cultivation of the earth's bosom wasn't ceremonial. This act of planting the deep seed and nurturing it so that it comes to light and bears fruit is very similar to the origin of the word culture itself, which also comes from cults. Cultivate the deep seeds of humanity that exist within man so that they may bear fruit, so that they may come to light. In other words, this was always considered a hieros gamos, a sacred marriage between light and earth, between fire and earth, with man as a bridge between these two worlds. Therefore, there are a lot of sacred festivals related, for example, to the time of cultivation, to the time of harvest. And today you completely mechanize the cultivation of the land, and the function is profit. To generate subsistence, physical survival. The cultivation of the land has been profaned. We exhaust the earth, mistreat the earth, destroy the earth, because it is no longer a right. The trivialization has taken over our most sacred acts. Sexual union has turned into a mere pursuit of pleasure, sometimes crude. In other words, there is no longer any involvement of love, no longer the repetition of the hieros gamos, the union of beings who don't just want to touch and leave, but want to add to each other's world, want to generate fruits. Not necessarily physical, but fruits of consciousness, fruits of understanding the other's world. They want to emerge greater than they entered. They want to enrich each other's world. All human acts have been desacralized. If you take, for example, the Analects of Confucius, the way he advocates the manner of sitting, eating, the way of passing by an elder on the street, a wiser person, or everything has a ceremony, a rite. And experiencing this rite adds more and more humanity to a person. He calls it the essential substance, the substance of being. And each time a person lives the rite, their life gains more real substance. He gradually takes hold of this substance of reality. And that is what corresponds to him, because man is meant to be nourished by metaphysical substance. Survival is one thing, but life, human life, is another. It requires different kinds of nourishment. And perhaps we have our animal self very well fed, but the human self is dwindling. Because we no longer know how to generate what nourishes the human self. And perhaps human suffering is a hunger for the human nature within us that we no longer know how to understand or address. He's going to talk about creativity. I found it interesting as it's a relevant topic today. All this set of discussions about artificial intelligence, human intelligence, what is creativity, what is innovation. He presents some very simple yet profound ideas about creativity. He will say that divine creation, which is the ultimate act of creativity, is an exemplary gesture of strength, abundance, and creativity. Every time a person wants to create, they should return to the source. The divine creation of man draws from the source of the creation of the universe, which is the greatest of all creations. A moment when everything expands from a single point. This moment is one of superabundance of energy and creativity. The creation of each being returns there and drinks from this source. And if a person wants to create something meaningful, not just move pieces around on the board, but truly add something valuable to the world, they should also lean in and drink from that same source. Otherwise, nothing new is created. Man doesn't know how to do more than just shift the position of the same pieces on the board. Creating a new algorithm, in other words, recombining things again. But to bring a new piece onto the board, you must drink from the source where things were created, lean over the fountain of ultimate creativity. All creations find their symbolic form in the cosmogonic myth. It's one of the elements that's interesting for us to pause and notice our ability to learn from life, how it creates, and what elements are at play. In many lectures, I often say that most of the topics being discussed today, nature would give us a wealth of lessons. The biodiversity of a forest gives us a wealth of lessons on how to live with different people. The way our mind guides our body offers a wealth of lessons about leadership. The way our body defends itself from external aggressors to survive provides a wealth of knowledge about peace, about security. In other words, if we were able to symbolically understand these primordial elements, the tools used in the creation of the universe, we would have all the keys to achieve true creation, which is nothing more than a capture of the realm of ideas. It's as if you took a flashlight in the realm of ideas, brought it down here, and shed light on an aspect of humanity that remains obscure. A latent power, waiting to be illuminated to come to light. That is true creation. It's not absolute creation. It is said that from the moment the universe manifests in the realm of ideas, everything is already created. But it's a bridge. It's about knowing how to ascend to this world and bring the necessary light to illuminate the obscure aspects of existence. These aspects become active and effective in life. Most of man is a mystery to himself, and it must be known before we reach the end of our journey, because that's what it's about. We came here to complete the work of nature, to build ourselves. To innovate and create is to unveil a new facet of the initial mystery. Basically, what I've already told you. To innovate and create is to reveal, to shed light. Things already exist, but they become effective when they are born into consciousness. We need our own nature to be born before our consciousness. This is the pinnacle of creativity. And by parallelism, whoever knows how to create within, that which is valid and real, knows how to create outside that which is valid and real. Otherwise, going back to the original example, we're just moving pieces on a board and nothing more, no new pieces. Walter Otto, who is a mythologist I really like, some time ago I was reading one of his books called Theophania. Because of this book, he was heavily criticized at the time by other historians of religions. Because at a certain point, he says, the Greeks did not create their gods created the Greeks. He said, there are certain models, archetypes, that when man needs to see them, he sees, and organizes himself according to these models. In other words, he doesn't see the absolute, he sees a facet of the absolute that he is meant to see at that moment. He returns to the essence, to the realm of ideas, and sees the model he needs to take the next step. In other words, the Greeks' need to take the next step made this facet of the One, the Divine, reveal itself to them. And this facet led them to become what they were historically. It constituted the identity of the Greek people. In a certain way, there is a face that appears on the horizon so that we can complete our individual and collective experience as a civilization. Something to be seen. And that is the great act of creativity. Notice the boldness of a historian to say something like this. The Greeks did not create their gods. Their gods created the Greeks. They fulfilled their dharma, as Heinrich used to say. They reached the end of their civilizational mission. Why? Because they saw in the realm of ideas what was expected of them. They understood their cosmogony. They understood the intention that was reserved for them in the realm of ideas. This is similar to the Mircea Eliade. He will say that there is nothing more creative than the ritual. The ritual awakens latent potentials. There is something divine in the human being, and the ritual awakens and liberates it. In other words, I repeat a primordial act, where humans interacted with heaven and earth, that is, with spirit and matter. They united all these things, and I begin to understand this and realize that I also have the possibility to do this with myself. Recover the system operator, and make it so that he organizes his system better. Understanding that life is not just a system coordinated by logic, by an operational algorithm that processes information. There is a programmer who processes this, and it has a purpose, an objective, a reason why, and a direction. When I understand these two worlds and coordinate them, I have the one who leads and what should be done with the vehicle. Otherwise, I will be led by I don't know whom, nor to where, randomly, or with an intention that doesn't align with anything I would want. So, I repeat this knowledge of working with heaven and earth when I understand this operation. In other words, the ritual reveals what you should do in your life, the next step. The ritual reveals, awakens, and liberates the essence of the human being dormant within him. the eruption of creative energy into the world, precisely this channel that the religious man knew how to create, by connecting all worlds, by believing that life can have a greater meaning than mere survival, by revealing something that has been reserved for humans since the beginning, reserved for the cosmos, he ensures that he is enriched. I really liked his expression. He is enriched with ontological substance, meaning a bit more being, a bit more essence. He starts creating identity in the true sense of the word. He is now not so much about appearance, he has a bit more essence. Each time he goes through the ritual and understands it a little more, he builds the spiral. In other words, man lives in real time when he is enriched with ontological substance. It gives birth to his essence, and the ritual allows him to receive more of this ontological substance. It's not that he receives, that he reveals, that he brings to light, that he liberates more of this being that lives within him. He says something very interesting regarding healing, even from ancient traditions that said, if you don't know the history of the evil that afflicts you, you have no way to combat it. So, it's a myth that tells how, at the beginning of time, good fought against evil. And even the medicines. It is said that in certain civilizations, if you didn't know the story of that plant, how it was mythically born, what properties it had, if you didn't know how to pronounce its name, it had no effect at all. The healing effect of the plant didn't come only from its physical body, because the ailment of man is not just in his physical body. If you don't know how to sing the myth of that medicine, it is not effective. It only brings a part of the remedy, and it doesn't address the entirety of the illness. Do you see how human life is all organized, and how we have so little effectiveness, because while we could be so much, we choose to be so little? Having the potential for so many layers, we choose to be so superficial. And our ailments remain without a cure. And we try to find physical cures for an ailment that is not merely physical. Finally, he will say that the sacred is real par excellence. Only the sacred gives a sense of reality to the fleeting time, to a world of shadows. It brings things to a dimension that nothing and no one can take away from you. It brings things to a dimension that not even death can take away from the children. Because death is not strong enough to consume reality. It is also an illusion. It consumes what belongs to its world. Illusion devours illusion. And that which is Socratic is no longer an illusion. Not event death can take it from us. It stepped out of its dimension of action. I remember a beautiful passage from a book I always mention to you, an Indian epic called the Ramayana, where at a certain there's a moment when Ravana, who was the great villain of the story, encounters Kala, time. And time threatens him, saying, I will take from your life, and he responds, who are you to take from my life? How dare you think you can take the life of Ravana, the one who died for love? Love is not part of your realm, it governs trends, temporary things. In other words, it's a very interesting discourse. This book is entirely beautiful, which shows exactly this fact that Eliade is talking about. Time consumes things from the dimension of time. Illusory. What is real is beyond your reach. And the sacred is real par excellence. The profane is not founded on any exemplary model. The trivial things we have in our lives, which hold no greater meaning, are not founded on any model. Therefore, they are a terrible map to guide you to anything of value. Because they don't know what is valuable. They have no touch of reality. Both profane things, they go in circles. They are disoriented. But that which is illuminated by meaning can give you meaning. It's interesting that in some lectures I mentioned to you that sometimes I walk into home decor stores and you see twisted crystal objects with 1,000 lights. The feeling it gives, at least to a philosopher, is like this. They are interesting objects, but I wouldn't take any of them home. Because they represent nothing. There is no message behind it. It's not a bridge. It's not a symbol. It's difficult today to find something imbued with meaning. Man does not seek meaning in things. especially in those with which he closely interacts. He looks for something that matches the carpet. The notion that things are bridges no longer exists. Through them, they can point you to something deeper. There is no symbolic meaning in the things that surround us. In other words, we have modernized our lives and the lives of everything that exists around us. There is no message in the things that man loves, in the things that man cultivates. They are superficial and fleeting things, characteristic of a consciousness that also reduces itself to this superficial and fleeting dimension. He will say that the profane act is opaque and exhausting beforehand. Every profane act not illuminated by a greater sense is opaque and exhausting. And sooner or later, it will make people dizzy from going around in circles, bewildered, disoriented. Boredom, exhaustion, the devaluation of life, discouragement, lack of motivation, and all the things that stem from this. Although we increasingly have the know-how, we know how, but we know less and less for what purpose, from where, and why. The profane act is trivial, exhausting, and disorienting. And this final part he mentions, which I found beautiful. Life is composed of an evanescent duration in conflict with a sequence of eternities. An evanescent duration in conflict with a sequence of eternities. From the victory of this sequence of eternities, you will have what you will retain and carry from this life. The only things that hold true. A sequence of eternity that we can create amidst what is evanescent. And its meaning, its sense, and what can be constructed within an illusory time. Portions, niches of real time. Until one day all time becomes real. The more we ascend a step towards the altar of Agni, the more we grant victory to these sequences of eternity over an evanescent time. We enrich our lives even more. And this eternity is what saves man from nothingness, from chaos and death. He will say that every time any religious myth speaks of the salvation of man, it is this salvation it is referring to. From nothingness, from chaos and death, taking man to a dimension that nothing and no one can take away from him. This is saving, this is rescuing man from banality. And finally, he talks about the eternal return, which is the same idea as the spiral we discussed. It's a tradition present in various civilizations. India speaks a lot about this, which are the cycles of karma. We will repeat the acts 1,000 times until we recover their meaning. Until the acts are born in meaning before our consciousness. Until it is born in meaning, we will pass through the same points. This is monotonous. The moment we open our eyes and discover the why, we understand the coded message in the acts, we no longer need to go through it. In other words, the eternal returns. Life presenting itself multiple times to our consciousness until we are able to read its message. And the message of life is sacred, eternal. The final message of life is the rescue of man from arbitrariness, from banality, from chaos, and from emptiness. And that's what we have in this second chapter. Next, we will move on to the third chapter. I hope you have the time to keep progressing in the reading. This book is very rich, and I'm sure it will be a milestone for you if you know how to read and digest it with the proper calm and attention. Thank you very much and see you next time.